Hi, we're Option Conservation, and this is the Shoot Room Sessions. Hey guys, welcome to the Shoot Room on Tour here in Edinburgh. Can you please tell people who you are and what you do?
I'm Meoni. I am a Senior Sustainability Manager at Abrdn, and I head up our Insights team, which is part of our central sustainable investing team. The team looks at insights around sustainability topics that will help us with our investment processes and integration. We cover 4 different areas. One is climate change, the other one is social, and we do governance. And then the final but not least one is the preservation of natural capital, which is the area that I cover.
Perfect. And that segues beautifully into Fraser.
So I'm Fraser Green. I'm Head of Natural Capital Investment at Abrdn. I work in the real estate investment side of the business. That's just the part of investments that's ultimately developed a natural capital strategy first. I'm currently focusing on launching that strategy as a fund, hopefully later this year. But otherwise, I have a portfolio of commercial property assets that I look after.
Nice. Can each of you give us a quick potted history of how you got from child and where you started to be working in what is the most exciting space to be in at the moment?
So not a finance background. I have always loved nature, and so I went to do geology undergrad, realised I didn't want to work in oil and gas, had a bit of a panic, spent 2 years completely lost, then decided to invest in myself, and I did a master's in environmental protection and management, and then I went on to consultancy, working in NGOs, working with companies to help them reduce their environmental impact, became an environmental manager of a company, which is now Abrdn, and then recently I moved into the investment space.
Exciting. I think probably the question I get asked the most about people early in their career is, should I do a master's in environmental stuff now to get a foot in the door as a career? What advice would you give people when they ask that question?
I feel like the world has moved on since I did it. At the time, it felt like, why are you going to do that? And I was like, because it's what I want to do. It's what I'm interested in. And it worked out. I don't think you need to have the academic background. I think you need to have passion. And the passion will lead you on to doing the right thing, researching the right space. So do you need to have the investment of doing a master's? Possibly not always.
I agree completely. My answer is always, if you're really excited about doing it and want to do it, absolutely run at it. If you're doing it to tick a box because you think an employer needs it, it's probably not the right employer. So we've got people with PhDs, we've got people who stepped foot in university for a week and then left, we've got people who never went at all. Our amazing podcast producer and videographer Josh, completely self-taught. So the whole spectrum of experiences, I just think follow your heart's the best advice I can go. What about you, Fraser? What's your story of getting to where you are?
So almost identical up to a point in that, always interested in wildlife and nature, did a geology degree. But then I took that further and I did a PhD in paleoecology. And then I packed it in.
Well, please explain to people what paleoecology is.
So reconstructing prehistoric environments. So my area of study was the Mesolithic of Western Scotland. So that was looking around the inner sound between Skye and Torridon, working with Mesolithic archaeologists, providing the environmental background, because as you can imagine, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers don't leave much in the artifactual record because they're moving around all the time. So I did that. Bluntly, again, this sort of relates to what you were saying. Back then, these things were considered odd. They were very poorly funded. Once it was finished, there was no more funding, frankly. And my now wife, then girlfriend, sort of looked at me askance, as if to say, what are you going to do now? So I retrained as a chartered surveyor, moved into property investment, ultimately ended up at one of the various businesses that became Abrdn, and I've been working on property fund management ever since, but have come full circle because of natural capital.
It's fascinating. When you get I went degree into PhD as well, and when you get someone back on their PhD topic where they clearly haven't spoken about it in decades, the language and the terminology, so you sped rightly. Fine frame.
Let's get this over with is the sort of the usual theme.
3 or 4 years of your life were things you were living every day, but you've put them on the shelf and haven't used them. So if someone says something to me, I go, oh yes, the subsurface bed form composition of naturally formed gravel bed river systems. I don't talk about that anymore. Essentially, how do rivers behave and move? But it's just embedded in there from. There's nothing worse than having to reread your own stuff over and over again it's
Well,
awful.
I remember the Viva being really panicked and nervous about it. And one of the sort of more junior teaching staff at the university beforehand said to me quite flippantly, enjoy it. This is probably the first and last time that someone's actually interested in what you've got to say. and I actually thought, you're right enough. And it did help me relax because I thought, I've got loads to talk about here. And this individual actually wants me to say something.
Yeah.
And I did enjoy it for that reason and suspect that it probably helped a lot in actually getting a pass. But yeah, that was the last time I actually spoke about it at any length because no one else is interested.
It's chapters of life. So you mentioned about the environment sector and geology and those worlds being viewed as somewhat odd. When I came out of university, so big data systems and environmental stuff, literally weeks after the financial crisis, I was unemployable. Everyone's like, what on earth are you going to do with that? Every qualification, no practical experience in business because I'd worked on building sites and manual jobs to pay for my way through uni. And now we sit in a place where alongside AI, natural capital is the most exciting and hottest area to work in. How have we got there? How have we seen things change in your careers? What's different now?
So back in the day when I started off, the focus was recycling and waste. And I think that we have just become aware of the complexity of our natural world, that we are not taking care of our natural world, and the fact that we rely on our natural world to thrive and survive. And so we need to start investing back into it. And I think that the general populace is more aware through climate change, and then climate change I see as the beginning of the wave, but then it's starting to make people realize that there's a whole lot of other drivers of nature loss that are coming and that we need to address. Is that a really roundabout answer?
I mean, it's, in a nutshell, the only thing I would say is sort of looking at it from an investment perspective is, particularly for institutional investors like Abrdn as competitors, where a lot of your client base is pensions, insurance, and that is, they're looking for long-term value. It's not just about, what kind of return are we going to get in the next year or two. It's thinking that you're going to be paying down these pensions to people in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. What does the world look like then? And anyone with any sense is going to think, potentially quite high risk. So how do we manage that risk today to mitigate it in 30 years such that people's investments are actually worth something? Because obviously if there's no soil and we're 10 meters underwater, then the world is not going to be supporting your pension plan, that's for sure.
I had an interesting debate with a very traditional land agent that said, oh, well, all this natural capital is all well and good, but how are you discounting land at the end of 30 years after a woodland? And so my approach is, well, you're turning a bare hill into a woodland, so I think you've got a change of state there that's happening. It's one thing turning into another. I said, just out of interest, how are you discounting the soil loss every year over the next 30 years from conventional farming? Oh, no, we don't count that. Okay, cool. Good chat. Can you give people a sort of an explanation and overview of Abrdn in general and the scale to which you operate and how you're beginning to look at natural capital?
This is that one for me. So yeah, the natural capital side, I suppose from my perspective, and again, this goes back to the fact that I work in real estate investments. And
just on that, I think that's a common place for it to be found at the moment. I think it sits nicely because it is based on a physical.
Absolutely. There is a physical asset. You're already in that market. You can recognize, how land assets work one way or the other. Yeah. But I think perhaps what people don't perceive in organizations like ours is that you're given quite a lot of autonomy to explore things within the group that you work. So there could, and no doubt are, other people in other parts of Aberdeen working on strategies that are complementary, but we aren't necessarily at the point yet where there's somebody above us directing us how to do it. It hasn't got to that point necessarily. But certainly, the real estate strategy we have is quite well advanced. There was myself and various others who sort of fed into it. The time sort of pre-COVID really accelerated during COVID. In all honesty, the model that I put forward was quite poor and it was not selected. And it's a former colleague's model that ultimately we work with.
So that's interesting. That's an impressive level of self-awareness and honesty there. What was the problem with the model that you first looked at?
It was, I mean, looking back, it was just wildly impractical. So I was trying to, I mean, it just was, but it was an idea. In some respects, it might work. And, you know, obviously, as we all know, this has evolved very rapidly in the past few years. And things that we perhaps felt, you know, things that we felt we could take for granted have not come to pass. And part of that was that the expectation that those who farm at marginal land and that might see that margin disappear would then be willing participants in a natural capital economy. And that's not come to pass, really. And my model is predicated on them being willing participants and us coming in and ultimately providing them with the premium that they were potentially losing from the loss of the CAP, for example, and working with us on a new management plan. But, you know, we referred to Wales earlier. That's somewhere where someone like me coming up with a model like that would, I think, be deeply unwelcome. And I understand that.
It's so interesting in terms of often an idea isn't a bad idea. The timing's just not optimum. So we met an amazingly exciting group working in Europe this week who are using that exact model, certainly in Spain and other places, and they have a list of farmers who are desperate and willing to work in a slightly different way. So they're based on biomaterials and growing hemp and remediating land and restoring soils, but they happily use local farmers and have a queue and a list of people wanting to do that. So it's timing, and I think each of these ideas, and it's how you mentioned waste and recycling before. I think that was a gateway into making us more conscious about our choices and our actions and about what we did. And by exploring that, we became to realize, well, hold on, just recycling isn't enough anymore. And it opens up our thought patterns and the art of the possible. So can we go on to the colleagues model that did grab? Because you were one of the first people to actually have an estate and a real asset to bring natural capital to life.
Yeah, so it's just far more straightforward. And it's just a pure carbon play, woodland code, peatland code. But what was really fortunate that one of our real estate funds, the fund manager, progressive, bold, had already quite a well-developed net zero strategy. You know, he was managing his emissions through his operations, recognized that there was always going to be a tail of emissions that needed to be offset, looked at this model and thought, that's a really bold statement. Let's insect by acquiring something suitable and generating the credits ourselves, and that just sit within our net zero strategy in the fund. So that's how that happened. It wasn't through us being able to build a separate strategy. It was one of our fund managers who was prepared to take on the model himself. So that was back in 2021. The colleague who developed the model has then continued to push it as I'm pushing it now, but ultimately lost patience and has gone elsewhere to push it. And, you know, good for him. We still speak, we're on very good terms, and I wish him all the very best. But in some respects, I'm quite glad he went because it meant I could replace him.
I love the radical honesty there. And what about, so in terms of your time with Abrdn, were you involved in that process, or has your involvement been later?
So I don't work on necessarily the real asset side of things. I work on the other investment assets that we have. So I tend to work more in fixed income and equity, and it's more about, I see it that I look at companies and the halting of nature loss. So I'm trying to get companies to manage that and address that more fully. Whereas you're working more on the restoration of nature side. So it's a very different view of the world. It's more about what are companies doing? Where are their risks and impacts in terms of nature? How should they be managing that? And who are the solution companies to help them manage that?
And how sophisticated are those conversations now? So, which I appreciate generalizing is terrible. But if we go across the spectrum in terms of the companies you're speaking to at the minute, how aware are they of their own impacts and the potential to do something about them?
It is very varied. So we speak to companies who, it tends to be kind of more in the primary sectors where they are more land-based and they are very, very aware of their dependencies and impacts. Those companies who have this, it's part of their business model and they know that they are reliant on nature, they tend to be more advanced, and the conversations that you have are a very different level. I even had one the other day. It was basically a company talking about no net vulture loss from their wind farms. Like, that's the kind of level some companies are operating at. And then other companies, you talk to them about natural capital and they'll tell you maybe about like what they're doing around waste or climate. Everybody talks about climate, but they're not thinking about all the other aspects, even if they might be really exposed to water, stressed areas. So it's very varied, but the big primary industries, they're starting to get really quite advanced.
Interesting. And are you seeing companies out there actively offsetting certainly their carbon side of things at the moment, or are they still waiting to see that market stabilize and crystallize?
So it's just very varied geographically. So you're going to have more UK, EU companies that are going to be doing that, or there'll be pods of companies in America who are going to be doing it. But there's a geographical tilt going.
Yeah, we've totally found that. So I spoke at an event for the Brookings Institute, which is a US-based think tank, overnight a few weeks ago, and they were very clear, and some of the questions from the audience were clear, that the sort of cultural connection with the environment is a generation behind where it is in the UK, and that's explained to me based on the amount of space the US still have, the amount of actual wilderness, the realities of climate change haven't been as stark on such a bigger area for as many people. So yes, it's hard and it's impacted specific communities, but as a populace, they don't yet have that sort of connection with the environment that we do, which is why I think certainly we're thinking about expansion to the US in future, because we think the scale and the opportunity there is huge. And it's the equivalent to acquiring land in Scotland 15, 20 years ago, which wouldn't we all like to go back and buy some of that now? It's changed dramatically. Fred, can we go on to institutions and pension funds and how you're hearing them think and talk about natural capital in general?
Yeah, so I mean, there was a real shift, and I appreciate that lots of people will probably, or some people will listen to this, and I'm bored of telling people this because it comes up all the time. But there was a real...
My learning on that point is we're not allowed to get bored of it, because we spoke before the camera started that we haven't reached a fraction of people yet. One of the things I was taught by an early chief exec was, until you are so bored of your message, people haven't heard it yet. So we need to give ourselves that extra vim and vigor to keep just reiterating and talking about everything nature-wise.
Yeah, so you'll have noticed this yourself. There was a shift last summer. I really felt it in that. Prior to that, when we've been pushing this strategy, we were bound to be consistently proactive. And although we were having lots of really positive conversations, we were struggling to move them on. And then there was a switch. And in fairness, the main driver here is that we were quite a small team and there was only so much of us and our time to go around. But there was a switch where suddenly we were the ones being sought out and quizzed. And we had no time to be proactive. We were constantly replying to requests for proposals or similar, pulling together new materials. It was the pressure was on us to respond to this new interest, and it's only been until about now that because of that, we've been able to generate more interest and assistance within the business, and there's enough of us now that we can be a bit more canny about how we delegate ourselves, and some of us are now able to go back out and be proactive. So that, I suppose, is one way of saying how that shift has occurred in the past, say, 9 months. One of the key things that we recognise from institutional investors is that with the new style of pension investment through direct contribution, for example, so a lot of these pension providers are quite fortunately going through a bit of a transformation themselves, and it's giving them the opportunity to sort of change the investment agenda, incorporate natural capital. And one particular large pension provider who we've been clients of ours on and off for a number of years, and we still speak to frequently, they were talking about a sort of 1 to 1.5% of their entire DC pot going into natural capital. Now that translates as something around £1 billion, and that's one UK institution. Scale that up through all the others and everybody else who potentially wants to invest in it. It's incredibly exciting.
So I think it's a useful point to give people a reference that going back 5 years or so, a £50,000 project in the environment sector was a significant project. You know, a £250,000 multi-year project was a huge thing for a wildlife trust or a rivers trust. So the scale to which we're talking about now, you know, hundreds of millions would rapidly transform the sector. You know, we're going to have deployed around 150 million to put together our portfolio in the 3 years we've been going. And other than Anders Paulson, no one's done that at that kind of pace before in nature. So $1 billion into the sector from one investor would be transformative. And, you know, when we were looking at potential long-term land acquisition plans, we think the sort of target estates in the UK are somewhere between maxing out at 5 billion if you can buy everything and that includes some Crown-owned land and things like that. So that's super exciting. That's starting to murmur. What are the things we still need to solve to make this real and investable for people?
So from my side, looking in the kind of issuer type world, data is very poor. We need to still focus on climate change, but start to expand that to cover the other areas of the environment and get companies to report on that. And we need to start engaging more and asking questions of companies. So those are the key areas for me.
One thing that's really impressed me sorry, you go on first, Fraser. I was going to be really complimentary about you guys. One thing that's really impressed me about your approach, out of every sort of fund manager or potential deliverer of a natural capital-based strategy, you're the first people that I spoke to that were thinking about the ultimate buyers of natural capital products so early in the process. Even us, we were like, right, we need to get out there, we need to build this portfolio because land is rare and precious and it's increasing in value, we need to go quickly. I haven't heard anyone else put as much time and effort, and you've got a team looking at this, thinking about who the ideal future buyers of natural capital products are. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, in some respects, there's an element of suck it and see to that. You know, we perhaps initially went out to corporates thinking that they would want that high quality offset strategy, and obviously there's a discount by do it with us. We generate the credits. You take a bit of risk, but there's a considerable discount this way. You get the credits. You've got something transparent, local, fabulous for your shareholders, your employees, your customers. But the feeling is that they haven't progressed quickly enough to be able to do that. I mean, it's happening, but it switched very much to, I guess, individuals like us, so investment professionals whose job it is to place capital, and they're being able to be a lot more nimble around how they do that. Now, we've only discovered that purely because, I guess, as a large organization, we work with so many of these different investors, and we're able to get a conversation, and they are able to express to us that this is something that they consider doing. And yes, you are talking to the decision maker, and yes, we want to do it in the next few months, and let's move forward from here. Otherwise, how do you do it? It's pretty hard if you're working. I mean, real credit to yourselves in that you've done it. You've managed to raise the capital much faster than we have, get it deployed without being a large organization who already has an incredible book of contacts to use. In some respects, of course, being small, it makes you nimble and decisive, and that's obviously what's held us back, because the computer sometimes says no.
I think we're incredibly fortunate that we've had incredible backing from the Auction House Group. So the board there have really supported us, and because they have a impact first driven approach, it is very much a commercial one. Preservation of capital and returns need to be a part of it, but impact and fun come early in that process as well. And as a result of that, we have been able to go quickly, and for all of us it doesn't feel fast enough, but it's only by trying it, getting it. What's really exciting is we've been able to take something that a lot of people are talking about conceptually, whereas we can say, oh no, we've experienced each of these 20 problems, and you can come and visit this estate. And we were having one conversation yesterday about a European group approached us, and they want to do something in Spain, and they were viewing the asset management side of it in the same way that you'd manage a solar farm. So one person could manage sort of 10 of these estates, could they? And I was like, No, it's a very different situation. So I was able to illustrate that sort of our workflow modeling software has 2,000 individual activities that we do as a team in relation to an estate. That's not plug a laptop in, report how much solar is being produced and captured, and cut the grass and move away. That's not to underestimate how amazing renewable energy is, but once it's operating, it's far more consistent than an estate that might have built property, ecotourism, renewable energy, agriculture, natural capital itself, people living and working on that property. So I think us having experienced all those things in the same way that, and talking about them is so important as well, which is why we really wanted to have you and others on the podcast, because it's only by getting the environment sector and the finance service sector to talk to each other that we can all share these challenges and problems, because if we work on them in isolation, we're going to move nowhere quickly. It's really interesting, the sort of asset management terminology. We talked before about how natural capital is kind of finding a home to start with in real estate and sort of built assets. There's also an appetite to align it with renewables, because you've got that initial period where it's cost of acquisition and planting trees and peatland restoration before revenues come. And we think for us, the terminology asset management's been quite challenging, because it's looked at a model that people are used to seeing as quite hands-off and let the business play out. Whereas actually what we do, and because we did all of our development internally as a fund first, haven't taken external capital yet, and we've been able to build out what that offering is. And actually we're doing deal origination, acquisition, asset development, delivery, management and exit. So we actually, if you put us through a lens of, say, an affordable housing firm, we're finding the land, buying it, getting planning permission, building the property, managing the property afterwards, which would usually be 4 or 5 different companies or functions. So that's been a really interesting one to even adapt the terminology and processes. What are some of the challenges you found in terms of actually, certainly with the estate, bringing it to life for people?
So, well, we've only got the experience of Farleah. So, this is our standalone. I mean, and that's fantastic, because, in many respects, it does set us apart from everybody else that we can say that we've got on the ground experience. 2021. Yeah. Bring it to life. I mean, I suppose it depends on who your audience is.
Has it been easier in the company now you've got a physical asset to be able to explain it?
Of course, absolutely. I mean, you can take them there for a start. The fact that it is in Scotland, it feels familiar enough. You can explain to people what you'd want it to look like ultimately once it's matured. Explaining within the company, I guess it goes back to that challenge that we discussed sort of off the record before around what is this and why. And some people just thinking, well, a forest is a forest. It's like, well, and the assumption that you're going to crop it. And what does it matter whether you're planting it yourself or whether someone's planted it for you, you're buying it? And obviously that's not what we're doing. So getting over those challenges, it's been great having something.
It's the early adoption, isn't it? It's people who, we're now at the point where quite a few people within the businesses have heard of something, but they don't understand the concept.
Narrative is so important to get people to understand what we're trying to do. And I think one of the good things that we did at Farleah was the work that we did with the Natural History Museum.
Yes. Yeah.
So the Natural History Museum has something called the Biodiversity Intactness Index. And it goes from 0, which is there's no biodiversity, to 100, which means it's pristine and it's completely resilient. And we worked with them and they tested Farleah before the restoration began. And it sat at 50%, which is just below the UK average level of biodiversity. But this is a site in a national park. And then they forecast forward after the restoration and it started to get into, over time, high 90s.
Yeah.
So heading back towards that pristine state. And you can put a nice visual around that. You can tell people the story and it brings a lot of concepts together.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is, that is perfect, because it's quite a straightforward way of demonstrating what you're doing and where it's going, and keeping, although the modelling itself is complex,
so complex.
And if you want to look at the modelling, if you're the kind of individual who needs to understand, you're not just going to take things at face value, you can look at that and it's it makes sense. There is considerable science and ecological know-how goes into it. But if you're wanting just a representation of where does this get us and what does it look like, then it's a really useful tool for us. Because in some respects, we need to keep things simple. just to get that message made. You know, it's very often, I suppose, we can get slightly into the weeds around what the nuances of biodiversity and ecosystem services and what goes where and how and what you expect to come. But still people that should know better are coming over and putting a Sitka spruce plantation on my desk and asking me if I want to buy it. So, keep it simple for now.
I would, it's hard, especially when you get a lot of those. So we get a lot of sort of intensive arable farms with huge property portfolios that people would like us to buy. No, thank you. We don't want to do that. I keep trying to go back to what's the intent, and the intent of that person is, oh, I'm excited and interested in what you're doing. Yes. Is it something like this? And it's having the resilience in this sector, because every day there's someone trying to have a shot at natural capital. So it's someone saying carbon credits are terrible, someone saying this project's not very good. It's so easy to recognise that actually the environment sector right now is being held to standards that no other industry or sector is. So are voluntary carbon credits and nature-based solutions the absolute solution to climate change? No, but they're one of the tools we've got, and they're a better alternative than anything else at the moment. So even if you have, I'd love us to be in a situation where we've planted too many woodlands in the country, and we're trying to solve that one as well, because boy, would we have moved forward in terms of carbon sequestration and look at some other ones. We just can't let perfect be the enemy of better.
Yeah, I mean, that's the essence of all of it, no doubt about it, because there's a lot of, trying to be perfect. And as we were discussing earlier, there's a lot of fighting that off and trying to give yourself the time to actually moving things forward. But as we've discussed, people need to feel consulted. There's a lot of strong feeling about it, particularly where it does involve people's locality. And in somewhere like Scotland, there is just a generational sense of outsiders coming in and telling them the way it should be done. Yeah. Finding a balance and a compromise with that, if we can do that over the next, say, 5 to 10 years, then that in itself would be an incredible victory for the natural capital and just, I guess, relations in Scotland between people and politics.
So we've seen a lot of fund managers announce an intention to do something, or a partnership, or a positivity. We get one of those every other week now. How far are we to see the first actual capital down 250, 500 million going and acquiring land? When do you think we will see that?
Ideally,
just as you close, yeah.
Yes, later this year. I mean, whether it's us or somebody else, you gotta feel it's going to be this year.
And if there was one thing that would stop that happening, so in a hypothetical, let's hope it is you and you've got an amazing pipeline of projects that can fly, if there's one thing that you would go, that's the thing that might catch us, that we wouldn't be able to get it just over the line, what is it you think?
It is, well, if we're saying what's going to stop us doing it this year, the likelihood is just the complexity of getting it going. If it's going to stop it more fundamentally, it is just getting private money to sign it off. Now, we've got 3 who are as committed as they can be without contracting. So, carry on as we are, it's going to happen. And there will be others who are in a similar position. But if you speak to any competing fund, they constantly say the challenge is getting the private capital to commit. There's plenty of public money is keen to get this going, but it's getting the privates to actually do it. And the reason is, we were touching on this earlier, like what are the biggest barriers? For me, the biggest barrier is just the perception of the carbon market. And we know there's a 2-tier carbon market. There's a high integrity, nature-based solutions, and then there's everything else. And the high integrity, nature-based solutions market's doing that, and the rest is doing all sorts of things, but quite a lot of that recently.
That exists in every market, and we seem to act like it's a surprise. You can buy a Vauxhall or you can buy a Tesla. You've got 2 ends of a market there. You can buy organic, locally sourced food, or you can buy absolute rubbish. Greggs will tell you stuff. There's an absolute divide there. You can make that choice. We're getting laughs off camera because and Chris, our amazing head of natural capital, was once rejected for a job at Greggs. So whenever I can make a joke at Greggs' expense, I always throw it in there. Yeah, every time. Yeah, but there's a spectrum in every market. Yet we go, oh well, there's some bad operators here, so the whole market's bad. We don't say that about food in general or anything else.
But it's a new market, right? So you just have to give people time to understand that and help educate them. So we've been trying to do that.
Yeah, well, that's what this is, I suppose. But yeah, I guess it just goes back to that as well as helping people understand where quality is.
Yeah.
And
What does it look like? What does a good carbon credit do?
whoa, well, you know this, but and before I say,
It means that because we've got.
yeah, indeed. Before I say that the challenge is that you try to say what a good quality carbon credit looks like, and lots of sensible, savvy people will look askance at that and say, where is the commercial upside? What gives this an edge? They're finding it hard to back something that is traditionally not added value. So we're talking about adding value to something that has no history of adding, a real value, and we've got to prove that. And of course, they say this two-tier market is proving that, but it's early. So a good quality carbon credit, I suppose, takes, considers and accommodates every other aspect of what's good in the land, or what we perceive to be good in the land. Obviously, it includes biodiversity, all the various ecosystem services around water quality, flood mitigation. It's got to consider carbon in other respects beyond woodlands, peatlands. It's got to be soil. Obviously, we know that there are codes coming through for salt marshes and similar. It's got to consider people. It's got to think about communities and jobs. It should really be thinking about enterprise and circular economy. It should be thinking big. It should be landscape scale. It should be working, on connectivity as much as possible. It's got to be holistic and idealistic, I think.
So where we are in terms of differentiation, I think what we're not trying to do is use carbon credits to solve every problem. So we're not trying to use the car analogy, we're not trying to say your Tesla should also be your house and your school and your hospital and all those other things. It should be really good at what it does. But for us, a premium carbon credit is one that's based on land that we own and manage for the purpose of conservation, that will be looked after long-term in perpetuity under some kind of conservation covenant, or looked after to ensure that additionality integrity, independently verified, monitored, geolocated, with the ability for people to visit it, touch it, see it, feel it. Because otherwise, if you've bought a carbon credit internationally somewhere, what is your real level of confidence that it's even there, that it's doing the right thing, that it's not having negative impacts? It's got to deliver positive impacts to the environment and to the local community in a meaningful way. And in terms of added value, I think it needs to be insured. It needs to have a quality mark against it. And where we think we can add the real value is, so we have ecotourism in a lot of these places, so you can literally stay as a team, as a corporate, as an individual, interact with that environment. And we're only doing transactions, entire projects with entire buyers. So as long as deciders, you will be the carbon partner for that project, you will get the photography, the videography and the story. So to come to your point on narrative, for your ESG team, and so often we see the environmental side of the business and the sustainable side sit within the comms department as well to tell those stories. So you will have a whole array of digital assets that come year on year as your project progresses. So we've sort of found that that's the best way to provide that added value component to somebody, which means that they're sort of bigger projects. So our smallest project we'd sell to anyone is 10 to 15,000 tonnes, and on our sort of bigger Scottish estates we've got projects into the 500,000 tonnes of carbon. Where we really like that is aligning it with the commitment from the people. So we spoke to one really amazing professional services firm who themselves have a relatively modest footprint, but they've said we want to buy carbon credits once, and we're going to buy 10 years worth based on our current footprint for the organisation, and we are literally saying we're never buying any more. This buys you a period to transition. You need to make it last, done and dusted. And I think that's really exciting, because then you're using that carbon credit and that relationship as an instrument to move the business forward. In terms of buyers, have you thought about who suitable buyers are and anyone you wouldn't transact with?
Yes.
So I'm going through a real journey of discovery on this, so I'm fascinated to hear your views.
Well, I mean, I suppose I could have tacked it on the end of my list there, is that, it's every partner needs to be moving towards the same goal. And a lot of this, I guess, perhaps one of the unsaid things that we all understand is that greenwashing ultimately is the enemy. And we can't, we have to resist that taint at every step, because the premium credit, that two-tier market, is predicated on people buying that move away from greenwashing. So the ultimate buyer of the credit plays a massive part in that, particularly if you've partnered with whoever it might be. It might be an NGO, it may be a consultant, individuals who are saying, well, we do it this way and we categorically do not want anything to do with, let's just say, hydrocarbons. And then you're selling that legacy to hydrocarbons, then the whole thing comes crumbling down.
And what do you think?
Yeah, it's one of the biggest problems with the voluntary carbon market is that the people that buy those carbon credits, it's perceived that maybe then it just gives them a reason not to reduce their actual carbon footprint. Now that, from everything I've read, is actually inaccurate, because if you're paying for it, you don't want to keep having a big carbon footprint. You want to reduce your carbon footprint. It gives you a financial reason to do that.
I always challenge that. Surely anyone who's worked in a corporate, try getting money out your board. If they're writing a check, a big check for a carbon footprint, that board's saying, I'm not writing this again next year. So I think, and there's been lots of studies recently that have been shared about how we are seeing people who are paying punitive prices on carbon. Now, the people are paying $1 a tonne. It isn't punitive. It's just fine. That's a tax of doing it. But if it is punitive, I think we are seeing those changes.
Yeah, I agree. So that then lends into the fact that you don't want to sell high integrity credits. You do not want to sell them to a company who isn't reducing its carbon footprint, because it just feeds into that narrative that it's basically a way of greenwashing and not actually achieving lower carbon.
So that was exactly my view 2 weeks ago. I now have an element of doubt in my mind about that, based on, so this same Brookings Institute event I mentioned, there was the most incredible professor from Yale, Professor Kelly Shue, and she is an expert in behavioural decision-making and economics. And she said she's vehemently against the concept of divestment in fossil fuel companies. And I was like, well, surely that's exactly the right thing to do. We shouldn't be funding these companies. And the whole room of people in the audience sort of quiet, and she made a point and she said, do you think the conversations are better when we're not there? And it was like one of those ideas where like someone flicks you on the end of the nose and it makes you go, oh wow, of course. And by people who care about the environment stepping away from that, if the only people in the room are those who believe in exploitation for maximum profit, it's only going to get worse. So I think it's a really difficult dichotomy, and it helps highlight the complexities of everything to do with natural capital, because other than crude oil itself, there's very few black and white situations. Everything's a shade of grey. Do I want to sell to a fossil fuel company? No, I don't intuitively, but do they have the ability to pay? Do they have the ability to make a splash at a big premium? Could you conceivably say, if you were to sell credits and put conditions on and said, if you fail to meet this and this, they come back, you have to give them up? Or could you use it as a vehicle to be an activist partner with this organisation and say, we will partner with you on this, but we are going to be incredibly vocal if you don't do what you say? Maybe, I don't know. I just think it's really difficult to know.
I think transition is important here, right? So you have a very small number of companies who are responsible for the majority of carbon emissions on the planet. You want them to transition. So if we hold them as an investor and we engage with them and we push them to transition, that's one element of that. So where is the risk? Are you managing that risk? And then on this side, from the carbon credit market, if they have a credible transition plan, then you could consider them to be a potential client.
Yeah.
The worry is the knock-on, isn't it? So I always had the view that if I was to sell a credit to EasyJet on day one, when I went to speak to Microsoft on day two, they'd say, I don't want to be a partner with these guys, because essentially we're going to sell such a limited number of, we might sell carbon once. In an ideal world, we would sell to Google or Microsoft the entire portfolio, because it's going to be sort of right now somewhere around 2 million tonnes. That would be amazing. And then we sell the whole narrative and the collaboration with it and elevate the sector. Worst case scenario, we're going to sell hopefully to 11 partners across the 11 estates we've got. So each one of those, if we sold to 4 or 5, they're effectively associates or partners because they're carrying a limited number of credits. So we're acutely aware of that as well. What are your views on that side of things, Fraser?
Well, I mean, I think everything you said is sensible and I agree with, but I guess it's just, are we at that stage yet? So and we can only work on it And that transitioning point is definitely credible and worthwhile. But there needs to be an acceptance from that sector and others that greenwashing is a thing, and that if they want to get involved in it, then it needs to be on different terms. And whether it's transition terms, whether it's on a kind of ratcheted agreement around how their behaviour as investors and businesses and operators affects their access to these credits. But we're getting the cash up front, and we're getting the impacts, and we're getting more natural capital into the market, and everybody's being as transparent as possible about what that arrangement is, then that's great. But that's another level of understanding for the media, for the world at large, for politics, that I don't think we're quite ready for. But hopefully we can get there, because what's the alternative? As you say, if we're not in that boardroom, and they are just making decisions without consideration for what we think is worthwhile, then we're in a sorry state.
Yeah, it's just there's so many of these situations that there is very few absolute rights and absolute wrongs, and we face these contradictions and challenges every day. So, I'm an environmentalist. I don't believe in killing things, yet we're managing deer numbers and killing a lot of deer to allow trees to restore. So I feel like a hypocrite and contradicting myself there. But this is the situation in the world we've put ourselves in, and we need to try and work our way through it. Speaking of contradictions and liars, politics. So we've got an election coming up. What are your thoughts on what we can hope for out of a new government? What would you like to see them do to help push forward a nature-based economy?
In some respects, the status quo, I feel, is okay, if only because the relevant agencies have an agenda. Okay, it could probably do with speeding up, particularly in Scotland, but you're generally having pretty sensible conversations, I find, with whether it's the agencies themselves, whether it's closer to actual government through the treasury banks or similar. There's a realization, and the individuals there seem to be working in the right direction.
We found similar. So I would say once you get away from the front page media politics and you actually get to the operational side of things we are having sensible conversations with people that want to do things for the better. So we found very similar, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and this perhaps could be a slightly controversial point, but natural capital, it feels in many respects that it's in the hands of a very unpopular sector of society at the moment that doesn't fit within the polarized politics that we see everywhere. And that is people who work for the government and people who work for corporates. We need the corporates to buy the offsets and to have a net zero strategy. We need the government to be sensible about allowing it to happen and to regulate it properly. Without that, it's going to be a real struggle. And who would have thought the day where you're sort of feeling reliant on corporates to support something as progressive as this? But that is where we are. Where does that sit politically? You can't help but feel that, I'm not suggesting that I would necessarily vote for them, but the Labour Party are sort of moving towards a more centrist position that would support a sensible long-term regulatory framework for natural capital.
Mm-hmm. And what about your perspective? I'm going to base it hypothesizing we're going to get, certainly in England, a Labour-led government. What would you like to see in terms of an approach to the environment?
So we think that we've made a lot of progress on the environment. I think on a macro scale, there's a bit of a focus on bullets, not bees right now, which makes a lot of sense given what's happening in the world. We had this 2 steps forward with COP15 and the global biodiversity framework. But what we haven't then seen is countries come and say what they're going to do to meet the requirements of that framework. And that should happen later on this year. So I'd like to see the actual plan of action, and that is supported by policy, even when we have a lot going on a macro level.
I heard one the other day, just promise less and do more. Yeah. And I think it's very difficult, isn't it? Because we've perpetuated an election cycle that's all about announcements and promises. And again, I saw one about the Tories arguing they're going to hire so many new doctors. And the comment was, is that before or after the 40 hospitals arrived that you promised in the last election? And it's so difficult. We've had a lot of politicians and members of the House of Lords on the podcast recently, and it's a really challenging job. We had one sitting MP say, I couldn't recommend this role to anyone else. It's so difficult. And this is a person who was genuinely civic minded, did the role to try and help people. And it's so incredibly hard. I think what we do need is, I was asked this on a panel, and I said, the thing I would like is an educated and qualified and interested environment secretary, and commit to not changing them for 2 years.
Well, that's going to say that. So it's ministerial change and lack of stability that's been a real problem across every sector recently. Bit of stability we could really do with that in politics. Whether we're going to get it or not, I don't know.
One of the topics that's getting a huge amount of coverage and discussion at the moment, despite the fact that we're in an election period, is land reform in Scotland. So Scottish Lands and Estates have come out with a piece recently saying they're really concerned about the impact this will have on business and industry, and certainly on the growth of natural capital and environmental restoration. What are your thoughts on it?
I suppose I know a few people who work at the sharp end of land reform. All of them are quite sensible individuals. I think that there is a real spectrum of wants and expectations here, which sort of follows the political silos. Some of the, at either end, I think it's unworkable, but I feel optimistic that a compromise position will be met. I mean, I think land reform is due. I think there's various aspects that, I think are necessary, even though they won't necessarily suit what we're trying to do, because it might make it more challenging, for example, to acquire land. But I think in a Scottish context, we sort of need to go through the eye of the needle, because there are aspects of how land ownership works here that, compared to other jurisdictions, for example, in Europe, makes us stand out as being particularly medieval.
So is it, can you illustrate that with an example? If there's one thing that you thought, okay, we probably need to change on, that would help.
I do think that transparency on transactions is probably needed. I think that's probably the single biggest bugbear for people who live in the Highlands in particular, is that these huge tracts of land that surround their communities that are owned by absentees who come and go, and they don't necessarily know who they are, and if you try to find out who they are, it's all offshored, and they've got no control over it at all, no agency, and before they know it, it's changed hands, they didn't even know it was on the market. I think there needs to be a process whereby there's this transparency around that transaction. That if you want to sell, at least people locally need to know there's an opportunity to acquire, even if there's no prospect of them doing so.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the one bit that we've been sort of citing on at the moment that makes it difficult, if you own a large area of land with multiple properties, the way the current thinking's drafted, you wouldn't, if you wanted to release one or two properties to the local community and sell them to allow people to live on that estate, that would be held up in a full public consultation about the entirety of the whole, which the sort of perverse about that is sometimes, so the Buccleuch estate have done some really amazing things where they've gifted community centres and sports pitches and things like that. As I understand it now in the drafting, you would be held up for an extended period of time even being able to do that, which surely isn't the intent. If you wanted to provide something either under market value or even sell it at market value but to a local buyer, surely that's a positive thing for land reform. So little wrinkles like that are the things I think that really need resolving. And also some recognition of the current baseline. So we haven't actually bought a Scottish estate off anyone from Scotland yet, as have all been bought by English or international buyers. And actually, as a result of that, we're saying, let's have more people on estates. It doesn't mean everybody. It doesn't mean we can invite 100,000 people to an estate, because too many people does damage as much as any other activity does. But there's more people coming than would have been in a traditional Grousemoor model that was friends and family come and shoot things and disappear for 11 months of the year. So it's really interesting. If we're sat here in 12 months' time, what do you think is different in the natural capital economy? What is the conversation about in 12 months? Your mind went somewhere exciting real quick. That was...
12 months' time, where would I like us to be? Or where do I think we will be? Where I would like us to be is that all of the countries that signed up to the Global Biodiversity Framework are holding corporates to account, and that they have to be providing for their shareholders transparency on their dependencies and impacts on the environment. That's where I would like to be. Where I think we will be is that some progressive countries will do that, and it will be a regulatory requirement in some jurisdictions, which is a step forward. I'd like a leap forward.
Nice.
An institutional investor actually doing it, ideally us in the UK. I suppose I would like to see the policymakers on particularly planting move forwards, just to make it much more geared towards natural capital, less geared, no disrespect to the forestry industry, but clearly they are a large lobby, and a lot of the policy is driven by their needs. And we're not wanting to take down the forestry industry. We need foresters.
We talked about that at length before we started, didn't we? That both very pro-forestry, want more native grown timber in the UK. We're just not foresters. We're advocating for a conservation-led natural capital approach. But shout out to all those people that are trying to do forestry in a more sustainable way. We need them too. We need lots of solutions.
And the verifiers, the codes need to be updated to reflect that, so that we aren't making mistakes with our plantings, for example, where it's inappropriately planted, but it's still funded and accepted by whether it's the consenting organisations. So that side needs to rapidly change to ensure that every time we do it, we're doing it properly, because there are, I think, still too many mistakes being made. And if we are moving into a phase where there's going to be rapid deployment, and perhaps the majority of natural capital projects are going to be starting in the next, say, 5 years, then we haven't got a lot of time to get that right. We need to get it right now. So it would be awful if we made a mess of it, wouldn't it?
Completely agree. And we'll conclude where we started about the point we've got differentiation is that the finance world and our society moves at such a pace. The environment doesn't. It changes in years, it adapts in decades, and it actually fundamentally becomes something different in centuries, and we're trying to force our timeline onto it, as was I've been asking you to predict a year forward. So thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate everything you guys are doing. I think Abrdn are doing something really exciting and looking at it in a different way, and I'm sure you're going to have an incredible institutional investor backing you guys and have a pipeline of projects in the next 12 months, and I can't wait to see what you do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Look at this.